and understand the world. But then, when I was a teenager, someone gave me this one, which was an atlas of a different kind of landscape. And I loved that one even more. It was such an enthralling read, and there were a lot of aesthetic similarities between the two kinds of atlases, between the geography and between the anatomy. And I could see that the blue veins and the red arteries and the yellow nerves were kind of similar to the rivers and the roads and the landscape, the contours of my other atlas. And I decided that no, I didn't want to be a geographer. I would be a doctor and learn about the landscape of the body. And also I wanted to travel, and so being a doctor is one of the best jobs for being mobile, because everybody needs doctors and everybody's bodies are pretty much the same all over the world. So I switched to study anatomy. Now, you can't see it very well in this picture, but this is my heart. And I'm going to start not with the brain actually, but I'm going to start with the heart. And I'm going to do some audience participation. I want everybody here to put their two fingers between their windpipe and the muscle and tell me if you have a pulse. Good. Everybody has one. Good. Okay, that's fine. So and then I can check at the end. But when I'm practicing in medicine, sometimes my clinic office, I get an urgent call and I have to rush out of the office. And I leave my stethoscope forgotten on the desk. And I arrive to the patient with no stethoscope. And it's very embarrassing, but I just have to listen to the heart the old-fashioned way, which is to take your ear and put it on someone's chest. And you can hear exactly the same. It helps if you stick a finger in the other ear. And after a while, you begin to hear the sounds that the human heart makes. And it's not the blood that makes the sound at all, it's the closure of the valves. Now, the first part of my presentation, I'm slightly anxious about whether it's going to work, but I have some sounds in the presentation which I hope might work. Let's try. No, didn't work. Oh yes, you have to listen. Can you hear it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, that is a healthy human heart. Nice sounds of valves closing. Now, it's very interesting to me that our idea of how the heart works as a pump is only 400 years old. Before 1628, everybody thought that the heart wasn't a pump. Actually, blood came often from the liver, and it moved up into the heart, and in the heart it was mixed up with air, or with vital spirit from the air. That was the Greek belief. That was the classical opinion of what the function of the heart was. And sometimes when you listen to a human heart, you hear these sounds which are not quite as clean as a closing valve. And you hear the sounds of turbulence within the heart. And it can be quite a beautiful sound. I'm going to see if you can hear the subtlety, because it's not all that loud, but I've got a sound for you of a heart which sounds a bit more like that Greek opinion, that Greek belief. Now, I'm sorry it's not coming out of the speakers, but when you practice medicine, of course, an awful lot of medicine, and I'm sure there's many medical practitioners here, but when you practice medicine, you know that a lot of the encounters, a lot of the engagements are very difficult. They're about breaking difficult news or trying to help somebody through a very difficult time. But sometimes medicine also offers wonderful opportunities for things which give you great energy and enthusiasm and relief, and heart sounds are one of those. For the last sound I hope that we're going to be able to hear, I wanted to talk about the moment when someone who is pregnant is worried about the pregnancy proceeding. And one of the most wonderful things you can do as a doctor is listen to the sound of the baby's heart and reassure that the baby's heart is beating very strongly and very powerfully and very well. And that's a consultation where everybody leaves very, very happy. And it's one of the most amazing things to listen to the sound of 2 heartbeats inside one human being. And if it's twins, 3 heartbeats inside one human being. And babies' hearts are very fast. They beat at more than double the speed of an adult heart. And so when you listen to this sound, I'd like you to try and hear the background slow wave of the mother's heart and the much faster, rapid beat of a healthy baby's heart. I never get tired of listening to that sound. It's such a relief when you find it. Now, whenever I talk about anything particularly gory or with a lot of blood, I will use a picture from Rembrandt and spare you original pictures with blood all over the floor. So I said this picture starts, this book starts in the brain. Now, a long time ago, I was a trainee in neurosurgery, and I had the experience of operating on a patient who was awake and able to talk to me while I was assisting the senior surgeon operate on the brain. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a taste of the opening of this book by describing the first encounter with a human brain. So I think we're going to have the translation through the headphones. I was 19 years old when I first held a human brain. It was heavier than I had anticipated, grey, firm, and laboratory cold. Its surface was slippery and smooth like an algae-covered stone pulled from a riverbed. I had a terror of dropping it and seeing its tight contours burst open on the tiled floor. It was the start of my second year at medical school. The first year had been a helter-skelter of lectures, libraries, parties, and epiphanies. We'd been asked to learn dictionaries of Greek and Latin terminology, strip a corpse's anatomy to the bone, and master the body's biochemistry, along with the mechanics and mathematics of each organ's physiology. Each organ, that is, except for the brain. The brain was for second year. And the neuroanatomy teaching laboratory was on the second floor of the Victorian Medical School building in central Edinburgh. Carved into the lintel over the entrance was surgery, anatomy, practice of physic. But the greater weighting given to the word anatomy was a declaration that the study of the body's structure was of the most importance, and other skills, like surgery or medicine, were secondary. I wanted, when I wrote this book, to write a chapter about the brain from the point of view of a surgeon, but also the brain from the point of view of a psychiatrist. And it's not surgeons that effect the most dramatic changes in the brain that affect the way we feel. Of course, the psychiatrists are trying to do this every day. They're trying to do changes with drugs, but also with treatments like electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. And so when I came to want to write about the brain and from the point of view of psychiatry, I wrote about this very dramatic treatment which we still use in the UK. I don't know how often it's used in Russia, but in the UK It's still used a few hundred times a year in Scotland, but it's very closely monitored, closely watched. And we don't use it anything like as often as we did in the 1970s. And I think ECT came about because it was such a dramatic thing to do to somebody, to induce an epileptic seizure. So you take electric current and put it across the head here, and it causes an epileptic seizure. And some people think it's really helpful. I have patients who are very supportive of this treatment and who feel it helps them. I have other patients who say that it is barbaric and that it should be illegal. It's difficult to know the right way forward. It's got such an ancient history, this idea of inducing seizures, and that seizures are in some way special. Again, if you go all the way back to the Hippocratic ancient Greek writings, then epilepsy was called the sacred disease, and it was thought that it put you in connection with God every time you had a seizure. That's why it was called the sacred disease. And there's still echoes of that very mystical, religious attitude that people have to ECT. This image just shows what a change it makes, with the brain waves on the left being normal brain waves, and then the seizure happens, and suddenly all the brain waves go like this. And I wanted the chapter to explain the two sides of ECT, that some people think it's a dramatic transformation that's worth going through, and some people think that it should be outlawed. This is a fracture of the collarbone. Can everyone see the snapped bone here? Now, one of the things that I love about medicine is that although science is developing all the time, and new treatments are developing all the time, the body and its failings remain the same, and have stayed the same for thousands of years. Now, believe it or not, there is an account of this injury in the Iliad by Homer. And if you read the Iliad, there is a description of the moment when Hector, the Trojan, takes a huge boulder and he throws it across the battlefield, and he hits Teucrus, who was one of the Greek archers, and he hits him right there. And Homer describes where. He says he hit him on the place where the shoulder connects to the neck, and immediately his right arm fell limp and he dropped his bow, and for hours he couldn't use the muscles of his arm. And this is a perfect description, 3,000 years old, of what in martial arts they call a brachial stun. A brachial stun is when you hit somebody really hard on the collarbone here, and it paralyzes the nerves which run behind that bone, and the arm falls limp and flat, and you can no longer fight. And if you go on the internet, you can see pictures of army recruits all over the world doing this to each other. Not breaking the bone, but paralysing one another's arms with these punches. And so the history of this injury, which is an injury I have seen in the emergency department a few times, is one that is very, very ancient. More Rembrandt. When I came to write about injuries of the arms in emergency medicine, I didn't just want to talk about the shoulder. For those of you who have ever worked in that environment, you'll know that there's a huge number of injuries that people do to their arms. And I was nervous about writing about it, because sometimes talking about it more doesn't help, but a lot of people cut their arms themselves. I'm sure you know of people who have done this to themselves. And if you work in the emergency department for long, you will have stitched up an awful lot of forearms. And when I wanted to write about that, I talked about why this is such a common problem, and it's quite a common problem all over the world. But also some of the other kinds of injuries you see in the emergency department. I once saw somebody who who shot a nail gun through his palm and nailed himself to a piece of wood, had to cut the piece of wood off on either side and come to the emergency department. And he made a joke. He said, look, I've nailed myself to a beam like Jesus. And I was able to tell him, well, no, they've shown that you can't have been nailed through the palm like that. There's science now showing that the palm can't take the pressure of a nail. And so I wanted the book also to describe this process of stigmata when people start to bleed from their palms, how that can happen when we know that that's not how crucifixion would have happened. Sorry about that. I wanted to do one more experiment, you see, which is to ask you all if you could give me a smile just for 5 seconds, like that. Okay, fine. Good, you can relax. Now I want you to give me a frown for 5 seconds. Good. Okay, the reason I talked about this was because I wanted you to think a little bit about how smiling and frowning made you feel. And then I want you to think a little bit about which one was easier. Because generally, most of us find smiling a lot easier. Now, when I was in medical school, I had 2 jobs. I had one job in the week in a bar and one job in the summer holidays, where I used to work in the anatomy department, dissecting cadavers for the students so that they could learn anatomy. And so I've probably dissected about between 20 and 30 human faces. And if you dissect a lot of different people's faces, you start to notice that there are differences between individuals. Some people have very big, strong, smiling muscles, which is this one. Zygomaticus muscles here. Some people have very strong frowning muscles. And some people, when I was doing the anatomy job, some people would have very withered little, very weak, thin muscles. And I would know that this was somebody who had almost never smiled for years before they died. Sometimes I'd find a face where one half was very strong and one half was quite weak. And I'd know that they survived for a while after a stroke, perhaps, or a Bell's palsy, which paralyzes one half of the face. I'm sure you've known people or had it yourself. It's a temporary paralysis of the muscles of the face. Now, Bell's palsy is named for Charles Bell, who made this drawing. Charles Bell was an Edinburgh surgeon 200 years ago, and he didn't want to be a doctor, he wanted to be an artist. All his brothers were doctors, and so they told him, you have to be a doctor. So he became a doctor, but he just did beautiful drawings instead of the body. He was a surgeon at Waterloo, and he noticed that it was important to study the muscles of the face in order to be able to accurately paint human expression. And we know that he wasn't the first to do that, because Leonardo da Vinci was doing exactly the same thing 300 years earlier. This is one of Leonardo da Vinci's drawings of the anatomy of the face. And see this muscle here? He's got an O. It causes you to do this, like snarl. He called it the muscle of anger. And the muscle which lifts up your eyebrows like this, he called it the muscle of fear. And he had the idea, you can read it in his notebooks, that our emotions are immediately connected to the muscles that we use to express those emotions. And so if you smile a lot, you get happier. If you frown a lot, you get sadder and frustrated. And if you're angry a lot, then you get angrier and angrier. It's such an interesting idea. And of course, when he set out to write, to paint the Last Supper, it's an incredible survey of human emotion. Every single apostle has a different expression, is trying to convey a different emotion. It was a little while after Bell that actually Charles Darwin picked up on all these different streams, and he wrote a wonderful book called the expression of emotion in man and animals. I don't know if you've seen it, but the expression of emotion in man and animals, he studies, all the different facial expressions of chimpanzees and of people and shows how similar they are. He tries to find out why we laugh and pointed out that laughing is the exact opposite of a screaming in terms of when you laugh, you do short breathings out like ha, 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 whereas when you're screaming, you do big long breaths out. But he noticed also this idea that if we keep looking sad, we get sadder. If we keep smiling, we get happier. And so, keep smiling, I hope. I wanted also this book to show that although the doctor's vision of the human body and the training that doctors undergo to appreciate the human body is very useful, it also becomes sometimes quite insensitive, and it becomes more and more difficult to see the effects of surgery and of different kinds of problems for the human being. So, my example, when I used to work in a breast surgery clinic, we would sometimes go and we'd have to examine and check the scars after a breast had been removed, and to check the scars are healing properly. And I don't remember anybody asking the patients very much how they felt about this change to their body. They were interested, is the scar healing? Is there infection? They weren't interested in saying, how do you feel about it now? Do you want to try to get reconstruction surgery? And I came upon this art project between a very brilliant Scottish poet called Kathleen Jamie. She was a poet living in Scotland, and she had to have breast surgery for breast cancer. And she talked about this. All the doctors would want to just check the scar. And she talks about this medical gaze, which kind of removes the individual and sees only whether the scar is healing. And she wanted a different kind of appreciation. And so, with a friend who's an artist, she sat for a whole series of incredible portraits, essentially, of the scar. And this is her mastectomy scar. It's a kind of Y-shaped scar that comes around like this. And the book is full of all these beautiful paintings of this thing which usually we look on as such a mutilation. Now, this is a related subject. I wanted to talk a little bit about the body and medical images as something that can also be beautiful. Now, not everybody finds that beautiful. Does anyone know what this is? It's a Barium Enema. Yeah. Sorry? Sorry? Yeah. Barium Enema. So they've pumped up air inside the intestine, is filled up with air, and then they have poured in this white liquid, and then the patient has to do this, and then we take the x-ray. And I wanted to show how these can sometimes be quite beautiful, these images that we use in medicine, and also they can show up some surprises. And the chapter itself talks about one of these that I took once, and right in the middle there was a great big bottle of ketchup, which somebody had put inside from that end up there. And there was a giant bottle of ketchup right through the middle. And there was a kind of pop art appeal to this image. And I thought maybe we could have it projected on the wall of the hospital. And the patient was in because they had abdominal pain and because they wanted to have this removed, this very large bottle, and they couldn't get the bottle out themselves. And so I arranged for a surgeon to come down and take the patient. And the surgeon said, "Great, okay, I've got the patient, where's the x-ray?" And I turned around and the x-ray had been stolen. So I don't have it anymore. but somebody else had appreciated this ketchup bottle as a magnificent work of art, and it's still hidden somewhere in Edinburgh. It's interesting that most parts of our body are made to last for 60 or 70 years before they start to wear out. But the placenta, of course, is only made to last for 9 months. And the placenta shows you really how fragile human tissue can be. By most of the time, once you deliver a baby and the placenta, if it's been there for maybe 42 weeks, if it's a long pregnancy, often it's already starting to break down. And some placentas in Scotland, where the diet is very bad and too many people are smoking and eating only fried food, the placenta is already breaking down and it's got hard yellow lumps inside it because of the Scottish diet and the Scottish cigarettes. And I thought it was fascinating that something which is only so fragile, so delicate, only made to last for 9 months, shows just how quick human tissue can start to fall victim to poor diet and smoking. Now, when I used to work as an obstetric junior doctor and I had to help deliver a lot of babies, we used to take these placentas and we put them in a bin. And we had these yellow bins like paint pots. And we'd seal the bin and then it would go off to the incinerator. And every evening they would all be burnt. I know there's some people who eat them and they think that it helps with postnatal depression. So the mood problems that happen after a baby, so they eat it and they say they feel better. There are other people who keep them and dry them out and keep them with the baby photos. And if you study the anthropology around the world of what different people do, it's kind of amazing. In China, they are used, in the Middle Ages in China, they were used as a spell to transform a boy into a girl. You would feed the baby boy placenta to try and turn it into a girl. In Iceland, they bury them, this is all old, used to bury them under the doorway of the house as a warding off evil spirits. And I read that somewhere in Russia that you would put it in a pot in the church and leave it there for a few days. This is 100 years ago or more, after the birth of a baby. But nowadays, the most amazing thing, we have gone from when I was a junior, we used to throw them in the fire. Now they preserve them because they're full of stem cells. And so something we used to throw in the trash, now you can pay to have somebody come and be on standby to help extract the stem cells just after birth and preserve them in case the baby ever needs them. Most of us don't spend any time thinking at all about our hips until they start to be painful. And the hip is the strongest joint in the body. It's so deep, it's such a deep cup. And in most people it doesn't start it gives pain much later than their knees. But if you do have a problem with your hip and you fall and break your hip, of course, it's a terrible injury. And if you fall and break your hip over the age of 70, then the chances of becoming dependent for care become very, very, very high. And the older you get, the more dangerous a hip fracture becomes. And I was very interested in the idea that there's this very strange story in the Bible when Jacob fights an angel. Everyone remember that story? It's way, way back in the very beginning of the Bible. Jacob wrestles an angel all through the night. And he can't beat Jacob. And so the angel dislocates his hip. And it says it there, and this is a text that's 3,000 years old as well. Dislocates his hip. And from then on, Jacob can't walk properly. He walks with this limp, a reminder of the night that he battled with this angel. And of all the patients that I've known that have had hip fractures, they have had some of the most difficult recoveries, some of the most difficult battles. And for many of them, they do end up being killed by their hip fracture. But for some of them, they recover and walk always with a limp. And when they recover, it's because of this. We have these wonderful titanium, chromium replacements that you can put in. Now, I once had a patient who had one of these, but there wasn't enough, and the patient died. And the family told me that she was going to be cremated. And they asked me, they said, what will happen to this metal hip when she's cremated? What are they going to do with it? And I said, oh, I don't know. I've never thought about it. I'll find out. So I spoke to the crematorium and I asked, what do you do with all these metal parts? And the answer was quite astounding. They collect them, and then they sell them, and they make parts for satellites and aeroplane engines. Because they're extremely expensive alloys of titanium, chromium, and vanadium. And so they would never just let them be buried or thrown away. And so I was able to tell this family that some part of this hip would be going on and perhaps be orbiting the sky above us. Now, I nearly finished. I've done a very quick survey, and there's some other chapters and other parts of the body explored in this book, but I want to finish, I'm getting near the end, with the foot, to tell you about a little story from being medical school. And my anatomy teachers used to ask me, they'd say, what is the most unique to humanity, the hand or the foot? And we would all say, the hand, of course, because we've got special thumbs. And they would say, no, the human hand is not that different from a chimpanzee hand. Actually, far more unique is our feet. Because we have all these arches. We have 3 arches in the feet, and they help us sustain this enormous weight. And until 30 years ago, it was thought that human brains developed very quickly. Well, our ancestors' brains developed, and then the ancestors came down from living in the trees and started to move north in Africa. And then 30 years ago, they found some human footprints, or very like human footprints, in some ash from 3 million years ago. And they showed